All right, everybody, we are going to talk about decision criteria, right? What do you take into account when making a decision, especially when it comes to public policymakers, i.e., government officials? So, the first thing to talk about is values, right? What are the values you are going to use to make a decision? And there are lots of different sources of values or types of values, right? There's the organizational values. So if you belong to an organization, whether it's the EPA or the House of Representatives or a university like I am, that organization's values tend to affect your decisions, right? So if I need to make a decision that might benefit a university around me, I'm probably going to make a decision that best impacts my university, right? And my university tries to teach or tries to instill values of, you know, making sure students receive a good education. So that's going to affect me. So I'm going to focus on students and what kind of education I'm providing to them. There's professional values, right? So lawyers and doctors obviously have a lot of professional values about what's the right thing to do and the wrong thing to do in certain situations that those professions find themselves in. As a university professor, there are professional values that university professors kind of have embraced and try to exemplify, not cheating, not lying to their students, etc., etc. Personal interest, right? We might have our own personal goals in mind, our own personal values of, I want this to benefit me, whether that's benefit me monetarily or benefit me, I want my descendants to be proud of me in 200 years. But that kind of what's going to benefit me is going to be an important value. Policy values or public values, what's going to help people, what's going to improve the lives of the people that are going to be affected by this decision I'm making. And then, of course, there's ideologies, right? Are you liberal? Are you conservative? Are you a follower of Hitler? Are you a follower of Karl Marx? Are you a follower of Jesus? Are you a follower of Muhammad, right? So those kind of personal ideologies that you subscribe to, those kind of come with a set of values that are going to influence how you make decisions, and then, of course, what decisions you ultimately make. Now, political party affiliation. Are you a Republican or are you a Democrat? And in some, local areas and stuff, they'll have true independents, but or third party people, but those are very few and far between. At the national level, it's pretty much exclusively Republicans and Democrats, right? And this is, disturbingly, the best predictor of congressional votes of any, if you only know one thing about a legislator or a potential legislator and you want to predict how they're going to vote on a certain topic or a certain law, knowing their party affiliation is the one piece of information you can have that will give you the best chance of successfully predicting how they view that thing or how they're going to vote on that particular issue. And political parties, as I said in a previous lecture, they kind of conglomerate issues, right? So political parties work for their common interest, right? If you're a member of a party and that party wants you to vote a certain way on a bill and you don't really care about that issue, you're going to vote the way your party does just because you want to support that group. You believe in their wider goals, their wider beliefs, their wider policy stances. And then when you have something you care about, your fellow party members who may not necessarily care about that subject are going to vote with you. That's kind of the benefit of belonging to a political party, is that kind of teamwork and that shared common interest, right? Now, not every policy area has a kind of political party differentiation, right? So Republicans and Democrats disagree on a lot, but there are certain areas where they kind of sort of agree, or it's not quite clear. There's lots of variability within the party, in both parties, and thus there's a lot of times more overlap. For instance, veterans benefits, right? Both parties really love veterans benefits and want to give veterans their kind of the best possible experience with, say, the VA and the GI Bill and all those things that they can. And then another big one is space flight. I'm a big space nerd, so I know that kind of Republicans and Democrats are not necessarily that much different when it comes to space flight policy. It's much more dependent. It's less dependent on party affiliation and more dependent on who they represent. So, a representative or a senator from an area with big space flight business or public facility, like the Johnson Space Center in Houston, Texas, or the Kennedy Space Center in Florida, or Goddard Space Flight Center in Maryland. If you represent one of those areas, or say where Boeing is headquartered, or where ULA is headquartered, you are much more likely to support space flight than a representative who doesn't represent one of those facilities or companies or organizations. And it's less dependent on party affiliation and more dependent on kind of geography, right? Which brings us to this slide, another thing that impacts decisions is your constituency. Who do you represent and what do they want you to do, right? Who voted for you? Who actually cast a ballot with your name on it, right? So obviously in the House of Representatives, this is going to be, in some cases, an entire state, but in most cases, just a teeny tiny little area of a state, right? In some cases, not more than, a few dozen square miles. In some cases, huge geographic areas, but roughly the same number of people. And the people who actually voted for you are going to have views about what decision you make in any given circumstance. So you need to take that into account, right? Because you want to get elected again, and you want to show the people who voted for you support. You want to kind of, you are there to represent them, so you want to kind of do what they would want you to do, right? Contrast that with public opinion, which is often the same, but not always, right? Public opinion means kind of the wider group. How does America, how do the people of the entire United States, whether they voted for you or not, whether you represent them or not, how do they feel about a certain policy area, and what do they want you to do with that decision choice in front of you, right? Now, there's a big problem with figuring out public opinion, whether you're talking about the entire United States or even just your constituency, right? The first is that the vast majority of Americans really aren't paying attention to the vast majority of public policy decisions that people have to make, right? They might pay a little bit of attention to the big stuff, but the vast majority of us just aren't paying that much attention to even a lot of the big stuff, but definitely most of the medium and small stuff, right? The public just doesn't know enough about any given policy area to have a really well-informed opinion on things like, trade with Mexico, or environmental standards regarding asphalt, and we have these kind of wider values, but we don't have really a lot of knowledge about the specifics of the vast majority of what the government actually does day to day. And then there's the importance of those issues to us, right? There are some there are a lot of issues where there's a very vocal minority that feel very strongly about an issue. And there's a big giant minority that disagrees with them, but they don't see it as very important, right? So there's a small group that says, we believe A and we're really passionate about it. And then a big giant group of people who says, no, we disagree with A, but it's not that important. It's not that big a deal. We're not going to base our votes on it. We're not going to kind of go out there and campaign for it. We're not going to pay a lot of attention to it, right? So do you go with the kind of vocal minority that is very passionate about it and believes very strongly about it? Or do you go with the majority of the people, but who don't really care that much about it, right? And then the other issue here is that public opinion is usually gauged via polls, right? And polls are becoming more and more and more difficult to do accurately. They're becoming way easier to do, with the internet. But to do accurately is getting more and more and more difficult because you need a representative sample of people, and response rates. If you call 1,000 people and ask them how they feel about an issue, how many responses are you going to get? 100? 50? 5? Right? And as time goes on, response rates are going down, which means that the people we're actually getting answers from are not a good representation of the entire group, whether we're talking about polling a state or a country or whatever. So public opinion polls are getting really difficult. So it's kind of difficult for any policymakers to really know what public opinion really is, right? Another decision criteria we can use is deference. Well, this other person or other group that I respect has decided they're going to make this decision, so because I respect them, I'm going to go with what they said, right? In the judicial field, we commonly refer to this as stare decisis, right? Let the decision stand. And that basically refers to judges kind of saying, well, these previous courts ruled this way on a very similar issue, so I am going to rule the same way in deference to that previous decision or that decision by a higher court or whatever, right? So deference, very important. And again, it can happen, it doesn't have to be like in it doesn't have to be formalized like in a court setting. It can just be, well, I'm a congressman and I don't really know how to make a decision on this, but my mentor or this great politician of the past said this thing about the subject, so, I'm going to go with that, right? So deference to what other people have said is a common factor in how people make decisions, how policymakers make decisions. We can look at the science. Right? What does the science say about this issue? We're going to use kind of published, peer-reviewed scientific data to inform what we should do with this policy. And I'm a big advocate for that. I'm a big advocate for science. I'm a big advocate for using science to guide our decisions. And there are some cases where it's really obvious. Science says we need to do this, right? Climate change, the death penalty, lots of other areas where the science is basically screaming, hey, we need to do this. We need to have this policy, right? But it's not always that clear, right? There are lots of areas where science is either just started, there's only a few studies about this, and it's, they come to conflicting decisions or conflicting conclusions, and it's not really certain what the nature of reality is. We need to study this more. We need scientists to come in. Another big problem with using science to look at decisions or make decisions is that you can find a scientist to support anything, right? If you look hard enough, You can find biologists that don't believe in evolution. You can find physicists that believe the earth is flat. You can find doctors that don't think vaccines are safe and effective. But those outliers do not change scientific consensus. Scientific consensus is about the evidence, not the number of people voting. Science isn't a democracy, right? So, but that can definitely muddy the waters. You can use these outlier scientists to kind of muddy public opinion and kind of create doubt in both the minds of the people and in your fellow policymakers. So there are lots of times when science is very, very clear and very kind of unified, but not always. Now, another decision criteria we could use is the public interest. I'm going to make the decision that is best for the public. But once again, this can be very difficult to define, right? What is in the public's best interest? In some cases, it's very clear, but in a lot of cases, it's really not. And then you get into little minutia like, are you talking about the public's short-term interest, the public's long-term interest? If 90% of people will benefit from this decision, but 10% of people will be hurt, is that worth it? Is that the public interest because 90 is more than 10? Or is the fact that 10% is hurt mean that it's not in the public interest, right? So again, there are lots of cases where the public interest is pretty clear, but when you start looking, you start finding lots of situations and lots of examples of where the public interest is not exactly easy to define. All right, that's the end of this subsection. Thank you a lot for watching.